Poor cleaning lady fell asleep in Billionaire's bed, and everything changed. She had been awake for nearly 40 hours when her hands finally slipped. Not from carelessness, but survival. Margaret Collins stood in the doorway of Robert Mitchell's master bedroom at 2:47 a.m., her reflection barely visible in the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Atherton's silent hills. The cedarwood scent was too clean, too expensive. The kind of clean that came from never being touched. She shouldn't be here. Dorothy Wilson's voice echoed in her mind. The master bedroom is off-limits. Always. But exhaustion doesn't negotiate. Margaret had sat down on the edge of the bed, just for a moment, and her body had betrayed her. Sleep came like a thief. When she woke, morning light was bleeding through the curtains. And footsteps were approaching. The door opened. Robert Mitchell stood frozen, his hand still on the handle, his expression unreadable. Not angry. Not confused. Something worse, observing. Margaret's heart slammed against her ribs. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. I'm so sorry, Mr. Mitchell. I didn't mean to. He raised one hand. Silence. The kind of silence that ends careers. The kind that follows you home. 48 hours later, Margaret stood in Dorothy Wilson's office, her hands folded, her spine straight despite the exhaustion pooling in her knees. You're being reassigned, Dorothy said, not looking up from her tablet. Effective immediately. Margaret's stomach dropped. Mrs. Wilson, I can explain. To the Mitchell estate. Full-time. The words didn't make sense. I don't understand. Dorothy finally looked up, her expression sharp as glass. Mr. Mitchell requested you specifically. I don't know why, and frankly I don't care. But Margaret, her voice dropped. Whatever happened in that room, it got his attention. And in Atherton, attention is never free. Margaret felt the floor tilt beneath her. She'd expected termination. Humiliation. A quiet exit and a stain on her record she'd never wash clean. Instead, she'd been pulled deeper into a world that didn't want people like her, except when it did. By the end of the week, the other housekeepers knew. Patricia Bennett cornered Margaret in the supply closet at the Wilson estate, her voice low and urgent. You need to be careful. Helen Carter's been asking questions. What kind of questions? Patricia glanced toward the hallway. The kind that wonder why a man like Robert Mitchell wants you in his house every day. Eleanor Brooks appeared behind her, arms crossed. They're saying you're clever. That you planned it. Margaret's chest tightened. Planned what? Sleeping in his bed, Eleanor said flatly. Getting caught. Getting close. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Margaret wanted to scream. To defend herself. But she'd learned long ago that women like her didn't get to be believed. They got to survive. I didn't plan anything, she said quietly. Patricia's expression softened. I know. But it doesn't matter what's true. It matters what they think. So here's the question. What happens when the wrong person notices you and refuses to look away? Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in California? New York? Somewhere else entirely? We want to know. And if you want to see how Margaret survives a world that was never built for her, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next will change everything. Trust me. You don't want to miss this. Margaret Collins had been awake for 39 hours. Not by choice. Never by choice. The bus from East Palo Alto rattled through the pre-dawn dark, its fluorescent lights flickering over faces that looked like hers, tired, weathered, invisible. She pressed her forehead against the cold window and watched the landscape change. Cracked sidewalks became smooth asphalt. Chain-link fences became stone walls. Apartment complexes became estates hidden behind iron gates and towering oaks. Atherton didn't announce itself. It simply was quiet, vast, and utterly indifferent to the people who kept it running. Margaret's stop was at the corner of Elena Avenue, where the streetlights were decorative rather than functional. She stepped off the bus into the kind of silence that only money could buy. No traffic. No sirens. Just the whisper of sprinklers on manicured lawns and the distant hum of a Tesla pulling into a driveway 3 houses down. Her hands ached. She flexed her fingers, felt the stiffness in her knuckles from yesterday's 8th-hour shift at the Wilson estate, followed by a night cleaning offices in Menlo Park, followed by this, another morning in someone else's world. Dorothy Wilson's estate loomed ahead, a sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion with terracotta tiles and bougainvillea cascading over the front gate. Margaret punched in the service code and slipped through the side entrance, her footsteps soft on the stone path. Inside, the house smelled like lemon polish and money. Margaret tied her apron, pulled on her gloves, and began. Dust the library. Vacuum the sitting room. wiped down the kitchen counters, scrubbed the guest bathroom until the marble gleamed. She moved like a ghost, silent, efficient, unseen. Dorothy Wilson passed her once in the hallway, barely glancing up from her phone. "Margaret, make sure the linens in the guest wing are changed by noon. We're hosting the Carters this weekend." "Yes, Mrs. Wilson." No greeting. No acknowledgement. Just instructions. Margaret had learned years ago not to expect more. By 4 p.m. her shift should have ended. But Dorothy appeared in the doorway of the laundry room, her expression tight. "Margaret, I need you to stay late tonight. The Mitchells' housekeeper called in sick, and Robert needs someone to prepare the house for his return. He's flying in from New York this evening." Margaret's stomach sank. She had another shift in 3 hours. If she stayed, "I'll pay you double," Dorothy added as if that settled it. It did. Margaret nodded. Of course. By 9 p.m., Margaret stood in front of Robert Mitchell's estate for the first time. It was larger than the Wilsons'. Quieter. More isolated. The driveway curved through a grove of eucalyptus trees, and the house itself was a study in restraint, clean lines, floor-to-ceiling windows, soft lighting that glowed like embers against the darkening sky. Margaret used the key Dorothy had given her and stepped inside. The air was different here. Cooler. Less lived in. She moved through the house methodically, kitchen, dining room, living room. Everything was already pristine, as if the house had been holding its breath, waiting. The guest wing was untouched. The office smelled faintly of leather and ink. And then there was the master bedroom. Dorothy's voice echoed in her mind, "The master bedroom is off limits. Always." But the door was ajar. Margaret hesitated. She should leave it, walk away, finish the job and go home. But curiosity, or maybe exhaustion, pulled her forward. She pushed the door open. The room was beautiful. Cedarwood and soft light. A bed with crisp white linens. A single photograph on the nightstand, too far away to see clearly. Margaret stepped inside. Just to check. Just to make sure everything was in order. She ran her hand along the edge of the bed, smoothing a wrinkle in the comforter. And then, God help her, she sat down. Just for a moment. Her body sank into the mattress, and the exhaustion she'd been fighting for 13 hours crashed over her like a wave. Her eyes closed. Just for a moment. When she opened them, the room was filled with morning light. And someone was standing in the doorway. Want to know what he does next? Subscribe now, because what happens in the next 60 seconds will change both their lives forever. Robert Mitchell had expected many things when he opened his bedroom door at 6:47 a.m. A perfectly made bed. Fresh linens. Maybe a note from the housekeeper confirming the house was ready. He had not expected her. A woman, small, dark-skinned, wearing a gray uniform, asleep on top of his comforter, her shoes still on, one arm tucked beneath her head like a child. Robert froze. His first instinct was anger. Someone had violated his space. His privacy. The one place in this suffocating town where he could breathe without performance. But the anger died before it fully formed. Because he saw her. Not as an intrusion. Not as a violation. But as a person so exhausted she'd collapsed where she stood. Her face was peaceful in sleep, or maybe just too tired to hold tension anymore. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes, and her hands, even in rest, looked worn. Calloused. The hands of someone who worked. Robert didn't move. He should wake her. Should say something. But words felt like weapons in a moment that required something gentler. So he stood there, silent, watching the rise and fall of her breathing. And then her eyes opened. Margaret's first thought was, "I'm dreaming." Her second thought was, "Oh God. Oh God. Oh God." She bolted upright, her heart slamming into her throat. Robert Mitchell stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, not angry, not shocked, just still. Mr. Mitchell, I'm so sorry," the words tumbled out in a rush. "I didn't mean to, I was just checking the room and I sat down for a second and He raised one hand. Silence. Margaret's mouth snapped shut. Her pulse was so loud she was certain he could hear it. "What's your name?" His voice was low. "Come. Margaret. Margaret Collins." He nodded slowly as if filing the information away. "You work for Dorothy Wilson?" "Yes, sir. She sent me to prepare the house." I know I shouldn't have been in here. I'll leave. Right now." "I won't." "How long have you been awake?" The question caught her off guard. What?" "You heard me." His gaze didn't waver. "How long?" Margaret swallowed. I'm not sure. Maybe 40 hours? Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, she would have hated pity. Something closer to recognition. Go home, he said quietly. Mr. Mitchell, Go home, Margaret. Sleep. I'll handle Dorothy. She wanted to argue, to apologize again, to explain that losing this job would mean losing everything. But the exhaustion was back, pressing down on her shoulders like a physical weight. So she stood, smoothed her uniform, and walked past him without another word. She didn't look back. By the time Margaret reached the bus stop, the sun was fully up, casting long shadows across the empty streets of Atherton. Her phone buzzed. Dorothy Wilson. Margaret's stomach clenched. She answered. Margaret. Dorothy's voice was clipped, professional. Mr. Mitchell called me this morning. Here it comes, Margaret thought. Termination. Blacklist. The end. You're being reassigned. Margaret blinked. What? Effective immediately, you'll be working exclusively at the Mitchell estate. 5 days a week. He's requested you specifically. The world tilted. Mrs. Wilson, I don't understand. Neither do I. Dorothy's tone sharpened. But Robert Mitchell doesn't make requests lightly. Whatever happened in that house, Margaret, you've gotten his attention. And in this town, attention is a double-edged sword. The line went dead. Margaret stood at the bus stop, the phone still pressed to her ear, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She should have been fired. Instead, she'd been claimed. And she had no idea why. What does Robert Mitchell want? And why her? Would you take the job or run? Margaret returned to the Mitchell estate 3 days later. This time she arrived at 8 a.m. with a new key, a revised schedule, and a knot of anxiety sitting heavy in her chest. The house was quiet when she entered. Too quiet. She moved through the rooms carefully, her footsteps muffled by thick rugs and polished hardwood. The kitchen was spotless. The living room untouched. It was as if no one actually lived here, just passed through like a guest in their own home. She was wiping down the counters when she heard footsteps behind her. Robert Mitchell stood in the doorway, dressed in a dark sweater and jeans, a coffee mug in his hand. Good morning, he said. Margaret's hand stilled on the counter. Good morning, Mr. Mitchell. Robert. She blinked. I'm sorry? Call me Robert. He took a sip of coffee, watching her over the rim of the mug. Mr. Mitchell was my father. Margaret didn't know what to say to that. So she nodded and returned to wiping the counter, her movements precise and deliberate. He didn't leave. You don't have to clean that, he said after a moment. I already did. She looked up, startled. Oh, I didn't realize. I'm capable of cleaning my own kitchen, Margaret. There was no edge to his voice. No condescension. Just a statement of fact. Margaret set down the cloth. What would you like me to do then? Robert tilted his head, considering. Whatever you think needs doing. I trust your judgment. And then he left. Margaret stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the space where he'd been, trying to make sense of a man who cleaned his own counters and then paid someone to, what? Exist in his house? It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. By the end of the first week, a pattern had emerged. Robert was home more than she'd expected. He worked from his office most mornings, took calls in the garden, occasionally disappeared for hours at a time. But when he was there, he noticed her. Not in the way Dorothy Wilson noticed, checking for mistakes, ensuring invisibility. Robert noticed like someone paying attention. He noticed when she skipped lunch. He noticed when she lingered too long in the guest wing, organizing linens that didn't need organizing. He noticed when her hands shook from too much coffee and too little sleep. And he adjusted. A sandwich appeared on the kitchen counter with a post-it note. Eat something. Her schedule shifted. Fewer hours, same pay. The guest wing was left unused, as if he'd decided it wasn't worth her effort. Margaret didn't know what to do with kindness that asked for nothing in return. So she accepted it silently and kept working. But the rest of Atherton noticed too. Patricia Bennett pulled Margaret aside at the grocery store one evening, her voice low and urgent. People are talking, Margaret. About what? About you. About Robert Mitchell. About why he suddenly needs a full-time housekeeper when he barely uses half his house. Margaret's chest tightened. I'm just doing my job. I know. Patricia's expression softened. But that's not what they see. Eleanor Brooks asked me yesterday if you were involved with him. The word hung in the air like poison. That's ridiculous, Margaret said flatly. I know. But Helen Carter doesn't think so. She's been watching. And when Helen watches, bad things happen. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd survived in Atherton by being invisible. By doing her job and going home. But invisibility was no longer an option. Robert Mitchell had seen her. And now everyone else was looking too. That night, Margaret stood at the bus stop, staring at the lights of the Mitchell estate glowing softly in the distance. She thought about quitting. She thought about disappearing before the whispers became accusations. But then she thought about the sandwich, the adjusted schedule, the way Robert had looked at her that first morning, not with pity, but with something closer to respect. And she realized she wasn't ready to be invisible again. Not yet. Have you ever been judged for something you didn't do? Tell us your story. 3 weeks into the arrangement, Robert Mitchell did something unexpected. He asked Margaret a question. Do you drink coffee? She looked up from folding towels in the laundry room, startled. He stood in the doorway, 2 mugs in his hands. Yes. Sometimes. Good. He held one out. Because I made too much. Margaret hesitated. This felt like a trap. Not a malicious one, but a trap nonetheless. Mr. Mitchell. Robert, she corrected quietly. I don't think. It's just coffee, Margaret. His voice was gentle, almost amused. Not a contract negotiation. She took the mug. They stood in silence for a moment, her holding the coffee like it might burn her, him leaning against the doorframe like this was the most natural thing in the world. Thank you, she said finally. He nodded. You're welcome. And then he left. Margaret stared down at the mug, plain white ceramic, no logo, no pretension, and took a sip. It was good coffee. The kind that cost more per pound than she made in a day. But it tasted like something else too. It tasted like being seen. The invitations continued. Not grand gestures. Not romance. Just noticing. He started eating lunch at the kitchen island instead of his office. Never asked her to join him, but always made enough food for 2. A second plate would appear. A second fork. Margaret would sit across from him, at first reluctantly, then with quiet resignation, and finally almost comfortably. They didn't talk much. But the silence wasn't empty. Robert would read the news on his tablet. Margaret would eat slowly, savoring food she hadn't had to cook herself. Once he slid the business section toward her. You follow the markets? Not really, she admitted. I know enough to know I can't afford to play. Smart. He took a bite of his sandwich. Most people who can afford it don't know when to stop. She glanced at him. Is that what you do? Play the markets. Among other things. He met her gaze. I build companies. Or try to. Mostly I spend money fixing problems other people created. Margaret set down her fork. That sounds exhausting. It is. He paused. But not as exhausting as working 40-hour shifts. Her breath caught. He remembered. Not just the incident. Not just her name. He remembered her exhaustion. Her vulnerability. The moment she'd been most human. I don't do that anymore, she said quietly. You adjusted my schedule. I know. His expression was unreadable. You shouldn't have had to do it in the first place. A lot of people do. I know that too. The conversation hung between them, too honest, too raw, too close to something neither of them was ready to name. Margaret stood. I should get back to work. Margaret. She paused at the doorway. You don't owe me anything, Robert said. I want you to know that. She looked back at him, this man who had every advantage, every privilege, every reason to ignore her existence. And yet he hadn't. I know, she said softly. But she wasn't sure she believed it. The turning point came on a Friday evening. Margaret was finishing up, wiping down the counters one last time before heading to the bus stop, when Robert appeared with a folder in his hand. I have a favor to ask. She tensed. Okay. There's a dinner tomorrow night. A fundraiser for Stanford's scholarship program. I'm expected to attend and I'm expected to bring someone. Margaret's stomach dropped. I'm not asking you to pretend to be something you're not, he continued quickly. But you're smart, Margaret. Observant. And frankly, you're the only person in this town I can stand to have a real conversation with. Mr. Mitchell. Robert, she said, her voice firmer now. I can't go to a Stanford fundraiser. I'm not. You don't have the right dress? He opened the folder and pulled out a credit card. Buy one. My treat. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? She met his gaze and for the first time she let him see her anger. I mean I don't belong there. And showing up on your arm isn't going to change that. It's going to make me a target. Robert's expression shifted, something like respect flickering in his eyes. You're probably right, he said quietly. But I'm asking anyway. Margaret wanted to say no. Every survival instinct she'd honed over years in Atherton screamed at her to walk away. But something else, something quieter, more dangerous, whispered, What if? I'll think about it, she said. Robert smiled. That's all I'm asking. That night, on the bus ride home, Margaret stared at the credit card he'd insisted she take. She thought about Patricia's warnings, Helen Carter's scrutiny, the way Atherton devoured people like her. But she also thought about the coffee, the sandwiches, the adjusted schedule, the way Robert Mitchell looked at her, not like a housekeeper but like a person. And she wondered, what would it cost to stop being invisible? He noticed again, but what would he do next? Comment, yes, if you'd have noticed her the way he did. Margaret didn't use the credit card. Instead, she took the bus to a consignment shop in Redwood City on Saturday morning, where she found a simple black dress, elegant enough not to embarrass him, understated enough not to draw attention. She paid with her own money. It felt important, like keeping a piece of herself intact. By 6 p.m., she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The dress fit perfectly. Her hair was pulled back in a low bun. She'd borrowed lipstick from her neighbor. She looked different, not transformed, not Cinderella, just visible. Her phone buzzed. Robert Mitchell, I'm outside. Margaret's heart hammered. She grabbed her purse, a worn leather bag that had seen better days, and headed downstairs. The car waiting wasn't ostentatious. A black sedan. Clean lines. Robert stood beside it in a tailored suit, his hands in his pockets. When he saw her, something shifted in his expression. You look, he stopped. Started again. You didn't use the card. No. Why not? Margaret met his gaze. Because I don't need you to buy me, Robert. If I'm doing this, I'm doing it as myself. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he smiled, small, genuine, almost relieved. Okay, he said softly. Then let's go. The Stanford Faculty Club was everything Margaret expected and worse. Crystal chandeliers. String quartet. Women in gowns that cost more than her annual rent. Men in suits that whispered old money and older power. Margaret felt every eye on her the moment they walked in. Not because she looked out of place, she'd made sure of that. But because she was with him. Robert kept his hand lightly on the small of her back. Not possessive, just present. Guiding her through the crowd with quiet confidence. Robert. A tall woman in emerald green approached, her smile sharp as glass. I didn't know you were bringing someone. Patricia Bennett, Robert said evenly. This is Margaret Collins. Patricia's eyes flickered. Recognition, calculation, something colder beneath the surface. Collins, she repeated. Have we met? Briefly, Margaret said, keeping her voice steady. At the Wilson estate. The silence that followed lasted half a second too long. Of course. Patricia's smile didn't reach her eyes. How unexpected to see you here. Life is full of surprises, Robert said, his tone pleasant but firm. If you'll excuse us. He steered Margaret away before Patricia could respond. She knows, Margaret murmured. Of course she knows. Robert handed her a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. Everyone here knows everyone's business. It's their favorite sport. Then why bring me? He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time that night his composure cracked just slightly. Because I wanted to, he said simply. The evening unfolded in a series of small wars. Eleanor Brooks asking pointed questions about Margaret's background. Helen Carter watching from across the room like a hawk circling prey. A man named Charles Whitmore leaning in too close, his breath smelling of scotch, asking Margaret what she really did for Robert. Each interaction was a test. Each smile a weapon. Margaret navigated them with the same skill she used to survive Atherton. Careful words, neutral expressions, giving nothing away. But it was exhausting. By 10 p.m., she excused herself to the restroom, needing a moment to breathe. She stood at the sink, gripping the marble counter, staring at her reflection. What are you doing here? The door opened. Helen Carter stepped inside, her silver gown shimmering under the lights. Margaret, isn't it? Margaret straightened. Mrs. Carter. Helen moved to the mirror beside her, reapplying lipstick with practiced precision. You've caused quite a stir tonight, she said conversationally. People are wondering about you and Robert. There's nothing to wonder about. Isn't there? Helen capped her lipstick, turning to face Margaret fully. A man like Robert Mitchell doesn't bring his housekeeper to a Stanford fundraiser unless he's trying to make a statement. Margaret's pulse quickened. And what statement would that be? Helen smiled, cold, knowing, dangerous. That he's either very brave or very foolish. She stepped closer. Let me give you some advice, dear. Men like Robert don't end up with women like you. They use you to feel good about themselves, to rebel against their world, and then they return to it. And you? You'll be left explaining to people like me why you thought you deserved to be here in the first place. The words landed like blows. Margaret wanted to argue, to defend herself, to scream that she hadn't asked for any of this. But Helen Carter wasn't wrong. Not entirely. "Thank you for the advice," Margaret said quietly. Helen's smile widened. "You're welcome." She left. Margaret stood alone in the restroom, her hands trembling, Helen's words echoing in her mind. "Men like Robert don't end up with women like you." When she returned to the main hall, Robert was waiting near the entrance, his expression concerned. "You okay?" "I want to leave," Margaret said. He didn't ask questions. Just nodded. "Let's go." They walked to the car in silence, the night air cool against Margaret's skin. Inside the sedan, Robert turned to her. "What happened?" "Nothing." "Margaret." "Helen Carter reminded me who I am," she said, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "And where I belong. That's all." Robert's jaw tightened. Helen Carter is a miserable woman who spent her entire life clinging to status because she has nothing else. Maybe. But she's not wrong. About what? Margaret looked at him. This man who'd invited her into his world without understanding the cost. "About us," she said softly. "Whatever this is, it can't work. You know that." "I don't know that." "Robert." "I don't know that," he repeated, his voice firmer now. "And neither do you." "Not really." Margaret wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to. But survival had taught her better. "Take me home," she whispered. Robert held her gaze for a long moment. Then he started the car. They didn't speak during the drive. When they reached her apartment building in East Palo Alto, the peeling paint, the chain-link fence, the world that existed on the other side of Atherton's gates, Robert turned off the engine. "Margaret. Thank you for tonight," she said, already reaching for the door handle. "It was educational." "Wait." His hand caught hers, gentle, not restraining. "I'm sorry. For putting you in that position. For not realizing how hard it would be." She looked down at their hands, his pale, smooth, uncalloused, hers dark, worn, a map of labor. "You can't fix this, Robert," she said quietly. "You can't make me belong in your world just by wanting it. I'm not trying to make you belong anywhere." His voice was raw. "I'm just trying to know you." The honesty of it broke something inside her. "That's the problem," Margaret whispered. "You don't know what knowing me costs." She pulled her hand away and stepped out of the car. Robert didn't follow. But as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she felt his gaze on her back, heavy, confused, aching. And she wondered if Helen Carter was right. If this was always going to end with someone getting hurt. Most people don't know this, but the invitation changed everything. Margaret didn't return to the Mitchell estate on Monday. She called Dorothy Wilson instead. "I need to be reassigned," Margaret said, her voice calm despite the storm in her chest. "Reassigned?" Dorothy sounded irritated. "Margaret, you've been at the Mitchell estate for barely a month." "I know. But I think it's best if I return to rotating assignments." There was a pause. "Did something happen?" "Everything happened." "No," Margaret lied. I think it's better this way." Dorothy sighed. "I'll make some calls." "But Margaret, Mr. Mitchell specifically requested you. If he's unhappy about this." "He won't be," Margaret said quietly. She hung up before Dorothy could argue. By Tuesday, Margaret was back at the Wilson estate, scrubbing bathrooms and folding linens and disappearing into the background where she belonged. Patricia found her in the kitchen during lunch break. "I heard you left the Mitchell job," Patricia said, sliding into the chair across from her. "Word travels fast." "It always does." Patricia unwrapped her sandwich. "For what it's worth, I think you made the right call." Margaret looked up. "You do?" Helen Carter was already asking questions. Eleanor Brooks was taking bets on how long you'd last. And Robert Mitchell. Patricia shook her head. "He's a good man, Margaret. But good men don't change the way this town works." "I know." "Do you?" Patricia's expression softened. "Because the way you looked at him that night?" "I wasn't looking at him anyway." "Margaret." Patricia reached across the table, her hand covering Margaret's. "I've worked in Atherton for 15 years. I've seen women like us try to cross that line. It never ends well. Not because the men are cruel, but because the world around them is." Margaret pulled her hand back. "I'm not trying to cross any line." "Good. Because the moment you do, they'll destroy you for it." "Not him. You." That night, Margaret's phone rang. Robert Mitchell. She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the decline button. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. 30 seconds later, a text appeared. "Robert, I heard you left. Can we talk?" Margaret set the phone down. She didn't reply. But Robert Mitchell didn't give up easily. The next morning, a package arrived at her apartment. No return address. Just her name written in clean, precise handwriting. Inside was a book, The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead, and a note. "Margaret, you told me once that you didn't have time to read. I thought you might want to start. I'm not trying to change your mind. I just want you to know I'm listening." Margaret held the book for a long time, running her fingers over the cover. It was a small gesture. Thoughtful. Kind. And it terrified her. Because kindness in her experience always came with a price. On Thursday, Helen Carter appeared at the Wilson estate. She found Margaret in the laundry room, arms full of freshly folded towels. "Margaret." Helen's voice was syrup over steel. "I wanted to check in on you." Margaret set down the towels. "Mrs. Carter. I heard you're no longer working for Robert Mitchell." Helen smiled. "A wise decision. I didn't ask for your approval." "No," Helen agreed. "But you have it nonetheless." She stepped closer, her perfume expensive and suffocating. "You did the right thing walking away. Robert is complicated. And complications in Atherton have a way of becoming catastrophes." Margaret met her gaze. "Is that a warning?" "It's a kindness," Helen said smoothly. "I'd hate to see you hurt. You don't even know me." "I know enough." Helen's smile didn't waver. "I know you're smart, capable, dignified. And I know that dignity is easier to maintain when you stay where you belong." The words hung in the air, velvet-wrapped cruelty. Margaret wanted to scream. To tell Helen Carter that where she belonged wasn't something people like her got to decide. But survival meant silence. So she said nothing. Helen studied her for a moment longer, then nodded, satisfied. "I'm glad we understand each other," she said. And then she left. That evening, Margaret sat in her apartment, Helen's words circling her mind like vultures. "Stay where you belong." She thought about Robert, about the coffee, the sandwiches, the way he'd looked at her in his bedroom that first morning, not with judgment, but with something closer to recognition. She thought about the fundraiser, the whispers, the way every eye in that room had assessed her value and found her wanting. She thought about Patricia's warning and Helen's smile and the weight of a world that had decided, long before she was born, where people like her were allowed to exist. And she made a choice. She opened her laptop and began searching for jobs. Real jobs with benefits and futures and paths that didn't depend on proximity to men like Robert Mitchell. If Atherton wanted her to know her place, then she'd find a place it couldn't touch. She'd build a life on her own terms. Even if it meant walking away from the only person who'd ever seen her as more than invisible. We've all faced choices where dignity costs more than comfort. What would you do? Would you have stayed or walked away? Subscribe because Margaret's next move will change everything, and it's not what anyone expects. Robert Mitchell stood in his kitchen at 7 a.m., staring at 2 coffee mugs on the counter. He'd made them out of habit. One for him. One for her. But Margaret wasn't coming. She hadn't come for 8 days. The house felt different without her. Not dirtier, not messier, just empty. Like a stage abandoned mid-performance, all props in place but no one to give them meaning. He dumped the second mug down the sink and tried to focus on work. It didn't work. By the end of the second week, Robert stopped pretending. He called Dorothy Wilson. "I need to reach Margaret Collins," he said. Dorothy's pause was telling. "Mr. Mitchell, I don't think that's appropriate." "I'm not asking your permission, Dorothy. I'm asking for her number." She requested reassignment for a reason. "What reason?" Another pause. She didn't say. But I assumed, given the circumstances. "What circumstances?" Dorothy sighed. "Mr. Mitchell, with all due respect, the optics of your arrangement with Margaret were becoming difficult to manage. People talk. And when people talk in Atherton, I don't care what people say. Perhaps not. But Margaret does." Dorothy's voice softened slightly. "She's a good worker, Mr. Mitchell. Smart. Reliable. And she's worked very hard to build a reputation here. Whatever happened between you two?" "Nothing happened." "Then why are you calling?" Robert didn't have an answer. Not one he was ready to say out loud. "Forget it," he muttered and hung up. He tried to move on. He threw himself into work, board meetings, investor calls, a new acquisition in biotech that required 18-hour days. But at night, when the house was silent, He'd find himself in the guest wing Margaret had organized so carefully. The linens were still perfectly folded. The closet still arranged with geometric precision. Everything she'd touched remained exactly as she'd left it, like evidence of a ghost. 3 weeks after Margaret left, Robert attended a charity luncheon at the Rosewood Hotel. Helen Carter cornered him near the dessert table. "Robert." She kissed his cheek, her smile practiced. "You've been scarce lately." "Busy, I'm sure." Helen sipped her champagne. "I wanted to thank you actually." "For what?" "For handling that situation so gracefully. With your housekeeper." Robert went very still. "What situation?" "The girl you brought to the Stanford event." Helen waved her hand dismissively. "Margaret something. I heard she's no longer working for you." "Very wise. These things can get so complicated if you're not careful." "These things?" Robert repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Oh, don't misunderstand. I'm sure your intentions were perfectly innocent. But appearances matter, Robert. Especially for someone in your position. Dating the help is." "I wasn't dating her." Helen raised an eyebrow. "No? Then what were you doing?" "Talking to her. Treating her like a human being. Apparently that's revolutionary in this town." Helen's smile thinned. "There's no need to be defensive. And there's no need for you to be cruel." "Cruel?" Helen laughed, light, airy, insufferable. "Robert, I was protecting you. That girl was getting ideas above her station. Someone had to remind her." "Remind her of what?" "Of reality." Helen set down her glass. "You can't save everyone, Robert. And you certainly can't elevate people just because you feel guilty about your privilege. It's patronizing." Robert stared at her. This woman who'd been a fixture of Atherton society his entire life, who'd attended his parents' parties and sent him congratulatory notes on every business milestone. He'd never seen her clearly until now. "You spoke to her," he said slowly. "You went to Margaret and told her she didn't belong." Helen didn't deny it. "I gave her advice. The same advice I give my own daughter. Stay in your lane. Protect yourself. Don't mistake kindness for opportunity." "It wasn't kindness," Robert said quietly. "It was respect." "Is there a difference?" "Yes." He stepped back, his expression cold. "And the fact that you can't see it is exactly why Margaret left." He walked away before Helen could respond. That night, Robert sat in his office, staring at his laptop screen. He'd found Margaret on LinkedIn. Sparse profile, no photo, just a simple listing. Residential services, Atherton, California. He could message her. Apologize. Explain. But what would he say? "I didn't mean for them to hurt you. I didn't realize my attention would cost you so much. Come back." Every sentence felt inadequate. Selfish. Like proof Helen Carter was right about him. So instead he closed the laptop. And he sat in the silence of his empty house, wondering when he'd started measuring time by a woman's absence. But 3 days later something changed. He was driving through East Palo Alto, heading to a site visit for a community housing project his foundation was funding, when he saw her. Margaret Collins, walking out of a small office building, wearing a different uniform, navy blue with white trim. A logo he didn't recognize. She wasn't alone. 2 other women walked beside her, laughing at something one of them said. Margaret looked different. Not diminished. Not broken. Lighter. Unburdened. As if she'd stepped out of his shadow and into her own sunlight. Robert pulled over, watching through the windshield as she climbed into a car with one of the women. He wanted to get out. To call her name. To close the distance between them. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she smiled, genuine, unguarded, free. Maybe it was the realization that his presence in her life had cost her that freedom. Or maybe it was just the understanding that loving someone, if that's what this was, meant letting them choose their own path. Even if it led away from you. Margaret's car pulled away. Robert sat in his sedan for a long time, watching the empty space where she'd been. And for the first time in weeks he felt something other than emptiness. He felt hope. Not for reconciliation. Not for return. But for the possibility that Margaret Collins was building a life that didn't need him to give it value. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what she deserved. Have you ever had to walk away from someone to find yourself? Tell us your story. Margaret's hands didn't shake anymore. 6 weeks after leaving the Mitchell estate, she stood in the small office of Comunidad Limpia, a worker-owned cleaning cooperative in East Palo Alto, reviewing the week's schedule with Rosa Martinez and Aisha Johnson. The Menlo Park contract came through, Rosa said, grinning. 3 office buildings. Recurring monthly. That's 15 new hours, Aisha added, pulling up the spreadsheet. We can finally hire another member. Margaret felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Pride. Not the kind that came from survival. Not the kind that came from being seen by someone powerful. The kind that came from building. We should interview next week, Margaret said. I know 2 women from the old Wilson rotation who might be interested. Rosa nodded. Let's do it. Comunidad Limpia had started as a dream. 3 weeks after leaving Robert's estate, Margaret had attended a community meeting about worker exploitation in Atherton. She'd gone expecting to listen, to nod along, to leave unchanged. Instead, she'd spoken. We don't need their permission to build something better, she'd said, standing in a church basement in front of 40 tired faces. We need each other. Rosa Martinez, a woman in her 50s who'd been cleaning houses for 30 years, had approached her afterward. You mean that? Rosa asked. About building something? Yes. Then let's build. They'd formed the cooperative with 5 women. Pooled resources. Split profits equally. Set their own rates. Chose their own clients. It was small. Fragile. 1 bad month away from collapse. But it was theirs. Margaret's phone buzzed. Unknown number. Hi Margaret, this is Patricia Bennett. I heard about your cooperative. Can we talk? Margaret stared at the message, her stomach tightening. Patricia had been kind once. But Patricia also worked for Dorothy Wilson. And Dorothy Wilson answered to people like Helen Carter. She typed back carefully. Margaret, about what? Patricia, about joining you. They met at a diner in Redwood City, neutral ground, away from Atherton's watchful eyes. Patricia slid into the booth across from Margaret, looking older than she had 6 weeks ago. Tired in a way makeup couldn't hide. I heard you left the Wilson estate, Margaret said. Quit, actually. Patricia laughed, bitter and bright. After 15 years. Dorothy didn't take it well. What happened? I got tired. Patricia stirred her coffee. Tired of being invisible. Tired of listening to women like Helen Carter talk about people like us as if we're a different species. Tired of watching good people like you get chewed up because you dared to exist outside the lines they drew. Margaret leaned back. So you want to join the cooperative? If you'll have me. Patricia met her gaze. I know you have no reason to trust me. I warned you about Robert. I told you to stay in your place. But I was wrong, Margaret. You were right. We don't need their permission to build something better. Margaret studied her. This woman who'd survived Atherton by staying small, by playing safe, by never asking for more. We split everything equally, Margaret said. Profits, work, decisions. No hierarchy. No exceptions. I understand. And if Dorothy or Helen or anyone from that world tries to interfere, then we handle it together, Patricia finished. That's the point, isn't it? Margaret smiled, small, cautious, real. Welcome to Comunidad Limpia. By the end of the 2nd month, they had 11 members. By the 3rd month, contracts with 5 corporate offices and 2 schools. They weren't competing with the big agencies, not yet. But they were building something sustainable. Something dignified. Word spread through the networks that kept East Palo Alto running. Church groups, community centers, mutual aid collectives. Women came to Margaret with questions. How do you negotiate rates? How do you handle difficult clients? How do you protect yourselves? Margaret answered them all. Shared what she'd learned. Offered what she had. Because she'd realized something important. Power wasn't given. It was taken. Built. Sure. And no one, not Helen Carter, not Dorothy Wilson, not even Robert Mitchell, could take it away once you claimed it for yourself. One evening, as Margaret locked up the cooperative's office, her phone rang. Dorothy Wilson. Margaret almost declined. Then curiosity won. Mrs. Wilson. Margaret. Dorothy's voice was measured, professional. I heard about your cooperative. And I'd like to hire you. Margaret blinked. Excuse me? Not for my personal estate. For my rental properties. I have 6 houses that need regular maintenance. I'm prepared to offer you a contract, competitive rates, recurring monthly service. Margaret's mind raced. This was a test. Or a trap. Or possibly both. Why? She asked bluntly. Dorothy sighed. Because you were the best worker I ever had. And because I'm tired of agencies that treat their employees like disposable tools. If you've built something better, prove it. We do it on our terms. I wouldn't expect otherwise. Margaret hesitated. This was exactly the kind of opportunity the cooperative needed. Stable income, professional legitimacy, a foothold in Atherton's economy. But it also meant returning to a world that had tried to crush her. I'll discuss it with my partners, Margaret said, and we'll get back to you. Fair enough. Dorothy paused. Margaret. Yes. I'm sorry. For not protecting you better. For not seeing what Helen Carter and the others were doing until it was too late. The apology landed like a stone, heavy, awkward, sincere. Thank you, Margaret said quietly. They hung up. That night, Margaret walked through her neighborhood, past the corner store where she bought groceries, the laundromat where she washed clothes, the park where kids played until the streetlights came on. This was her world. Real. Messy. Alive. And she'd built a place in it that didn't require anyone's approval but her own. She thought about Robert sometimes. Wondered if he thought about her. But the ache had softened. Transformed into something gentler. Gratitude maybe. For showing her what it felt like to be seen. And relief. For learning she didn't need anyone to see her in order to exist. Her phone buzzed. Rosa, Wilson contract, what do you think? Margaret smiled. Margaret, let's vote on it. Tomorrow. Together. Because that was the point. She wasn't alone anymore. She'd never have to be invisible again. If you were Margaret, would you have walked away or returned? Subscribe, because what happens when Margaret and Robert's worlds collide again will leave you speechless. The invitation arrived 3 months after Margaret had left. Not to her apartment. To the cooperative's office. A formal envelope. Thick cardstock. Embossed lettering. Stanford University cordially invites you to the Community Leadership Gala honoring local organizations building economic justice in the Bay Area. Rosa read it aloud, her eyebrows climbing. They want to honor us? Someone nominated us, Aisha said, scanning the letter. Comunidad Limpia is listed as one of 5 featured organizations. Margaret's stomach flipped. Who nominated us? Doesn't say. Patricia held up the RSVP card. But they're offering a table for 8. Full dinner. Recognition ceremony. Are we going? Rosa looked around at the faces gathered in the small office. 11 women who'd built something from nothing. Margaret thought about the last time she'd walked into a Stanford event. The whispers. Helen Carter's smile. The weight of being watched by a world that didn't want her there. But this was different. This time she wasn't someone's guest. She was being honored for her own work. Yes, Margaret said firmly. We're going. The gala was held in the same venue as the fundraiser Margaret had attended months earlier. But everything felt different. She walked in wearing the same consignment black dress, because it still fit and she still liked it and she didn't need a new one to prove her worth. Rosa, Patricia, Aisha, and 4 other cooperative members walked beside her. A delegation, not a tag-along. The room was full of academics, non-profit leaders, philanthropists. Some faces Margaret recognized from Atherton. Others were new, community organizers, activists, people who built things from the ground up. Margaret Collins? She turned. A young woman in a Stanford Development Office badge smiled. I'm Emily Chin. I'll be presenting your organization tonight. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for inviting us. Emily glanced at her tablet. Actually, you should thank your nominator. He was very insistent that we recognize your work. Margaret's pulse quickened. Who nominated us? Emily smiled. He asked to remain anonymous. But he'll be here tonight if you'd like to thank him in person. Margaret knew before she saw him. She felt his presence the way you feel a shift in air pressure before a storm. Robert Mitchell stood near the back of the hall, hands in his pockets, watching the ceremony set up with quiet attention. He looked the same. Tailored suit. Clean lines. That careful stillness he carried like armor. But something was different too. He looked lighter. Less burdened. As if he'd set something down and was still getting used to the space it left behind. Their eyes met across the room. For a moment, neither moved. Then Robert walked toward her, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. Margaret. Robert. They stood 2 feet apart, the noise of the gala fading into background hum. You nominated us, Margaret said. I did. Why? Robert's expression was unreadable. Because what you built deserves recognition. And because I wanted you to know I've been paying attention. To me. To the work. He paused. To you too. But mostly the work. Margaret's chest tightened. You didn't have to do this. I know. His voice was quiet. But I wanted to. No strings. No expectations. Just acknowledgement. She studied him. This man who'd seen her when she was invisible, who'd offered her coffee when she was exhausted, who'd invited her into his world and then stepped back when it became a cage. Thank you, she said softly. Robert nodded. You're welcome. The ceremony began. Emily Chin stood at the podium, introducing Comunidad Limpia with words that made Margaret's throat tighten. A worker-owned cooperative that challenges exploitative labor practices and builds economic dignity for immigrant and low-income workers. Rosa squeezed Margaret's hand. Patricia wiped her eyes. When they were called to the stage, Margaret walked up with her team, 11 women who decided they were worth more than invisibility. The applause was genuine, warm, respectful. And for the first time in her life, Margaret stood in front of Atherton's world not as someone's housekeeper, but as someone who'd built her own. After the ceremony, the reception buzzed with conversation. Non-profit leaders handed Margaret business cards. A reporter from the Mercury News asked for an interview. A venture capital firm inquired about impact investing opportunities. Margaret navigated it all with the same grace she'd once used to navigate Dorothy Wilson's rules: careful, strategic, giving nothing away for free. And then Helen Carter appeared. She looked older than Margaret remembered, thinner. Her smile was the same, but the edges were sharper, desperate in a way wealth couldn't hide. Margaret. Helen extended her hand. Congratulations. Truly. Margaret shook it briefly. Mrs. Carter. I wanted to apologize. Helen's voice was lower now, almost sincere. For what I said. At the fundraiser. I was unkind. You were honest, Margaret corrected. About how you see the world. Perhaps. Helen's smile faltered. But perhaps I was wrong about some things. Margaret held her gaze. You weren't wrong about everything. You were right that Robert and I came from different worlds. You were right that attention has a cost. But you were wrong about what I deserved. Margaret's voice was steady, clear. I didn't need Robert Mitchell to give me value. I already had it. I just needed to stop letting people like you convince me otherwise. Helen flinched. For a moment, Margaret almost felt sorry for her. This woman who'd spent her entire life clinging to hierarchies because she'd never learned to build anything of her own. Almost. Enjoy your evening, Mrs. Carter, Margaret said and walked away. She found Robert near the terrace doors alone, staring out at the darkened campus. Avoiding the crowd? She asked. He turned, smiled slightly. Something like that. They stood in comfortable silence, something that would have been impossible months ago. Your cooperative is impressive, Robert said. I mean that. Thank you. Are you happy? The question caught her off guard. Margaret considered it. Really considered it. Yes, she said finally. I am. Robert nodded, something like relief crossing his face. Good. Are you? He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time she saw the truth. Getting there, he said quietly. Some say she should ignore him. Others think reconciliation is inevitable. Should Margaret give Robert another chance? Or is walking away the stronger choice? Subscribe now, because the final chapter will answer the question everyone's been asking. Can two people from different worlds ever truly meet as equals? The answer might surprise you. 3 weeks after the gala, Margaret received a text. Robert Mitchell, would you like to have coffee? No agenda. Just coffee. She stared at the message for a long time. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard, composing and deleting responses. What's the point? Haven't we moved on? Finally she typed. Margaret, when? Robert, tomorrow. 10 a.m. That cafe in Redwood City you like. She smiled despite herself. He remembered. Margaret, okay. The cafe was nothing special. Cracked vinyl booths, weak Wi-Fi, coffee that was good enough to sustain life but not celebrated. Margaret arrived first, claiming a corner table away from the window. Robert walked in exactly at 10 a.m., dressed casually, jeans, a sweater, no armor of expensive fabric. He looked normal, human. Hi, he said. Hi. He sat down. Ordered coffee. Didn't fill the silence with nervous chatter. They waited until the cups arrived. I don't have an agenda, Robert said finally. I just wanted to see you. To talk. If that's okay. It's okay. He wrapped his hands around the mug. I've been thinking a lot. About what happened. About the mistakes I made. Robert. Let me finish. His voice was gentle but firm. I didn't understand what it cost you to be seen with me. I thought visibility was a gift. But for you it was a target. And I'm sorry. For not protecting you better. For not understanding sooner. Margaret looked down at her coffee. You couldn't have protected me. That's not how it works. I know that now. And I don't need protection anymore. I know that too. He met her gaze. That's why I wanted to see you. Not to apologize for something I can't fix. But I don't know. Start over, maybe. On equal ground. We were never on equal ground, Robert. No, he agreed. But maybe we could be now. Margaret studied him. This man who'd seen her, who'd stumbled in trying to honor that seeing, who'd stepped back when his presence became a burden. What does that look like? She asked. Equal ground? I don't know, Robert admitted. But I think it starts with honesty. And choice. No expectations. No savior narratives. Just two people who respect each other figuring out if there's something worth building. That sounds terrifying. It is. He smiled, small, genuine, vulnerable. But I think you're worth being terrified for. They talked for 2 hours. Not about the past. Not about what went wrong. About books. Ideas. The ridiculous cost of Bay Area rent. Margaret's cooperative expansion plans. Robert's new community housing initiative. They debated politics, disagreed on policy, agreed on principles. They shared stories, his about growing up with money he didn't earn, hers about growing up with dreams she couldn't afford. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Margaret realized something. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of being seen. Not of being judged. Not of the cost of existing outside the lines Atherton had drawn. Because she'd built something those lines couldn't touch. When the coffee ran out and the cafe started filling with lunch customers, they stood to leave. Outside, the midday sun was bright and merciless. Can I see you again? Robert asked. Margaret considered the question. Really considered it. Not the danger. Not the cost. Not what people would say. Just the simple truth of what she wanted. Yes, she said. But slowly. On my terms. Of course. And if it doesn't work, if the world makes it impossible, then we'll deal with it, Robert finished. Together. Or separately. Whatever you choose. Margaret smiled. You've learned something. I had a good teacher. They didn't kiss. Didn't make promises they couldn't keep. Just stood in the sunlight, two people who'd been broken by proximity and rebuilt by distance, trying to figure out if there was a way forward that didn't require either of them to disappear. Same time next week? Robert asked. Same time next week, Margaret agreed. She watched him walk to his car, not a luxury sedan this time, just a normal Toyota, and drive away. And then she walked in the opposite direction, toward the bus stop that would take her back to East Palo Alto, to the cooperative, to the life she'd built without anyone's permission. But this time she carried something new. Not certainty. Not a guarantee. Just possibility. The possibility that being seen didn't have to mean being consumed. The possibility that two people from different worlds could meet as equals, if they chose to build the bridge themselves. The possibility that nothing was given but everything could be chosen. Margaret's phone buzzed. Rosa, contract meeting in 20 minutes. You coming? Margaret, on my way. She pocketed the phone and boarded the bus, watching Atherton's walls and gates disappear in the rearview mirror. She didn't know what would happen with Robert. She didn't know if the world would let them try. But she knew this. She was Margaret Collins. She'd survived exhaustion, humiliation, and invisibility. She'd built something beautiful from nothing. And whatever came next, with Robert or without him, she'd face it the same way she'd faced everything else. With dignity. With strength. With the knowledge that her worth had never been his to give. It had always been hers to claim. The ending isn't what most expect, but it's exactly what mattered. If you choose dignity over comfort like Margaret, subscribe to join our community of people who believe your worth isn't negotiable. What door would you have chosen? And where are you watching from? Tell us your story. Because Margaret's story is over, but yours is just beginning. Subscribe. Share. And remember, nothing is given. Everything is chosen. Choose wisely.